Welcome to Networking RX, a podcast devoted to helping business professionals like you enhance your networking skills in order to become more proficient giving and receiving quality business referrals and improving the overall quality of your life and the lives of those around you. The Networking RX podcast is a production of AmSpirit Business Connections, an organization whose mission is to empower business success through networking.
Welcome back. I'm Frank Agan, founder and president of AmSpirit Business Connections, and your host of this episode of the Networking RX. Thanks again for listening, subscribing, and referring others, and certainly thanks for the comments and questions. If you are a consistent listener, or if you've even just been a consistent listener this year, back in January 14th, I did an episode with Dr. Wayne Baker, who is the author of All You Have to Do Is Ask. We talked about that book, and so if you have an opportunity, go listen to that episode. But in that episode, he talked about the reciprocity ring. He referred to the reciprocity ring, and he kind of touched on a little bit as to what it's about. But before we finished up that interview, I told him, I said, we need to get you back on because I really kind of want to talk about this in a little more detail. The first interview back on January 14th was really about the book and All You Have to Do Is Ask. The inspiration for that book and all the material in there came out of this reciprocity ring. So I wanted to bring Dr. Baker back on. Again, he is the author of All You Have to Do Is Ask, and he is the professor, the Robert P. Tomei Professor of Business Administration and Professor of Management and Organization at the University of Michigan. Also, he's a professor of sociology there. And he's the faculty director of the Center for Positive Organization. And he's a great guest for us because he focuses his teaching on and his research on social capital, social networks, generosity, really networking, professional relationships and networking. And he's an author of several books, and he's had articles in Harvard Business Review, Chief Executive Magazine, Sloan Management Review. The neat thing, again, I mentioned this in the first podcast, is that he just doesn't do research. He applies the research, and I think there's lots of useful stuff for us with what he has to say. So, Wayne, thanks for coming back on. I do appreciate your time. I know you're busy, but I really want to talk about this reciprocity ring. How did it all come about? You know, what it is and how it all came about, I think would be a great jumping off point for us.
Well, great, Frank. I'm glad to be back on your show again. Thanks for the invitation. Yeah, so the reciprocity ring, I have to go back about 20 years when Cheryl Baker and I had a very important conversation. So she was talking to me one day about how and what I teach to my MBA students here at the Ross School of Business. And I was trained to analyze social networks. And I said, okay, well, I teach my MBAs how to analyze their networks, to interpret their networks. We draw diagrams and so forth. She said, okay, that's great on the analytical side, but what do you tell them to do? And I said, well, I kind of have a few stories, a couple of anecdotes, and I'm hoping the bell's going to ring and I'm going to run out of time because, frankly, I don't have a lot.
Right.
And so that led to a very interesting discussion where we're saying, well, I said, if you think about this idea of social capital includes two things. It includes our networks and then how we use our networks. And she said, what do you mean? I said, well, the how is based on the principle of generalized reciprocity. Nice academic phrase for you. So reciprocity, when we think of that, we usually think of it, you help me and I help you, which is great. We would want that to happen. But generalized reciprocity is at another level. So let's say that you help me, I feel grateful, which motivates me to pay it forward and help a third person. So it's reciprocity more at the network or at the system level, if you will, at the group level. So with that, we worked together and we created the reciprocity ring. So very simply, it's a process by which people ask for something they need, that's the request, and then people will think about how they could help to fulfill that request. And there's two ways they could help. They've got the answer, they've got the resource, they have the knowledge, whatever, and they could share that resource, or they can tap their network. And everyone's got great networks. They say, look, I don't have the answer, but I know who does. It's not someone here today, but I'll introduce you to that person. So those are the two ways you could help. As I mentioned when I was on in January, What I used to think is that getting people to help, to be generous, was going to be the problem, the real obstacle. Rarely was that the problem. The real problem is getting people to ask for what they need. One reason the reciprocity ring works is that everyone is required to make a request. It's the ticket of admission. And I think psychologically, it feels a bit safer if you know that everyone's in the same boat and everyone's going to make a request. And we focus a lot on how do you make a request, what are the criteria for an effective request, and so forth. But I could describe an informal version of the reciprocity ring, and I write about this in my new book. So essentially, you have a group of people. You give everyone a flip chart page, one of the ones that are sticky on the top, and a marker, and say, okay, on the top half of that page, I want you to write a request, something that you need. And I usually give a bunch of examples of requests people have made in the past, and I talk about the criteria for a well-formulated request. I said, but write whatever it needs to describe that request and leave the bottom half blank. And once you're done, take that Post-it paper and stick it up on the wall in the room. And so everyone will do this. And if you see this, I've done this with large groups and small groups. You see that, the walls are covered with flip chart pages where the top half is somebody's request. So after you've done that, you then walk around and you read everyone's requests. And if you could help, you put your name and your contact information on it. And what happens is that people start collecting names of people who said, I can help you with that, or I can connect you to someone who can help with that. And it's actually very effective. People get to make requests, people get to reflect on them, walk around, and what they find in that informal reciprocity ring is the same thing that we see in the formal version, is that everyone gets the help that they need, but they find that they spend most of their time helping other people. And it's this more generalized form of reciprocity that the people you help are usually not the people who help you. It's usually the more indirect networks of helping.
Well, and that's a perfect example of how networking is supposed to work. You're supposed to do things for other people and just trust that it's going to come back to you. Just focus on keep helping people, and it'll, don't keep score. Keeping score is counterproductive to the whole process. Now, when you talk about formalizing this, you're going into large companies, large organizations. Is that where it's happening?
We use it in large organizations, use it in executive education, be another example. We use it in programs that are for a customized program for specific companies, and others that are open enrollment that executives come from all different companies. And what we found is that the reciprocity ring, or this informal variation, it seems they just always work. I rarely could say that something is guaranteed, but I say that these are guaranteed as long as you follow the recipe. And that's especially true for the formal reciprocity ring, which does take a little bit of training. It's more powerful than the informal one. But with a little bit of training, you learn the recipe. And as long as you follow that recipe, you're going to get a good result at the end.
Now, I think I read that over 100,000 people have been through reciprocity rings. Is that?
Yeah, it's closer to 200,000 now.
Oh, okay. All right.
And it's been done all over the world. So far, it's been done in 20 different countries and 12 different languages.
Wow. And
it's interesting. People have say, oh, well, this might work here in the States, but it would never work in fill in the blank, right?
Right.
But I'll say, well, it does work there. So we've used the reciprocity ring in Korea, China, Saudi Arabia, all throughout South America, different countries in Europe, and of course in the US and Canada as well. And it seems to really tap into a human universal, this idea of being generous and helping people and making requests. And remember, it turns out that that's the key to the whole giving, receiving process, is the request. And that's why I wrote the book, All You Have to Do Is Ask, because we learned over time that that's really the driver of the whole giving, receiving process. If everyone wants to give, but no one's willing to ask, nothing happens.
So you say it works, universally works. Are there situations where it might be challenging? I would imagine there has to be a level of trust. If you're in a situation where you don't necessarily trust the people, it's not going to work as well.
Yeah, so we've found that it works with groups of strangers, works with people of various ages. But there was one example or one instance where it didn't work very well. And I can only give you the broad outlines of this because it has to do with the intelligence community. And it was a group of people from the intelligence community, and they're not a very trusting group. So
Okay.
they're very suspicious of everyone, including one another. So that's all I can say, Frank.
Okay. They have to kill you, right? I get it. Well, I guess that answers my question. I mean, there needs to be a level of trust. People need to feel a level of safety to be putting things out there.
Yeah. So there is a concept that I read about called psychological safety, which means people feel free to speak up, to ask for what they need, to admit a mistake, and so forth. And some workplaces have higher levels of psychological safety than others. But here's what we found. It's kind of circular, which is, of course, if the workplace is psychologically safe, then the tools I write about are more effective. But what we found is, as long as you use the tools, you'll make the workplace more psychologically safe. So it doesn't matter where you jump into that circle.
Right.
And again, what I found is that if people start using these tools, they usually make safer requests in the beginning. But if you do it over time, in fact, I encourage people to run an experiment, say in a group or a team, take some of the tools that I write about, pick one that sounds good for you, and use it for at least 45 days, to run the experiment. And what I found is that if people will do it for that period of time, they learn the benefit and they see the importance of asking and generously giving. So that's really, and that could work in a psychologically unsafe place. It will make it more psychologically safe by using the tools.
In our interview back in January, you shared a story about a woman over in France who had made a request and actually saved the life of, I think it was her niece you had indicated. Are there other notable successes? I mean, I'm sure there's 200,000 people making requests. More often than not, things are happening. But are there other notable successes or unusual things that can really demonstrate the power of the reciprocity ring?
Yeah, that reminds me of a ring that I ran for a large automaker. And so there's a bunch of engineers and other people in the reciprocity ring. And there's a very senior engineer who was working on a really complex metallurgical problem, something that had to do with aluminum extrusion. And I have to admit, I had no idea what he was talking about, but other people did. And he described this problem and he said, my request is to consult with an expert on this particular manufacturing process. Well, the help came from a very unlikely source. It was a 22-year-old admin who had just been hired by the company. And he wondered, how could that person possibly help?
Right.
Well, she said, my father is the world's expert on that problem. He recently retired, and my mom has been encouraging him to spend more time outside the home. Right. So she made a connection to her dad, and the senior engineer and her dad, the world's expert, sat down and they figured out this problem together. And that illustrates that you just never know, and you should never underestimate the power and the abilities of a person or of a group, because people know lots of things and they know lots of people. And again, that's the two ways you can help. Right. Is that you have the resource or the answer and you can share it, or you can tap your network.
Gotcha. And somewhere else in the world, somewhere else in the United States at that same time, the wife was in a reciprocity ring and her request was, find a way to get my husband out of the house more often.
Yeah, that's right. So getting him do something productive, right?
Yeah. Yeah. How formal does an organization need to be? Auto industry, I'm assuming was it a trade association? I don't need names, but it was a trade association or actual company that's inviting you in. Could a community say, hey, Dr. Baker, would you come to Columbus, Ohio? We have, various community leaders here, no real affiliation.
Yeah, so we've done the reciprocity ring and related tools. We also have Givitas, which is the digital or the online version of the reciprocity ring. And the real advantage of Givitas is that you're not constrained by size. We have very, very large groups in Givitas, these Givitas communities. One I can relate to you includes HR leaders from across all these different companies, about 1,500 people in this HR Givitas group. And they ask for just amazing things, like what I consider to be very difficult requests. But, someone who's struggling on an HR problem in one company, that's probably been solved someplace else. They just don't know where. But when they
Right.
post the request in this Givitas community, they find that it's been solved or addressed in 3 other places. And the generosity that people have displayed is really quite amazing. Like, here's my 20-slide PowerPoint deck on how you want to pitch this problem to your boss or something. So that would be an example. But we use these tools with companies, trade associations. They're widely used in many of the top business schools around the world. We've used them in law firms, medical settings with physicians. I ran a reciprocity ring for a survival flight. It's the people at University of Michigan Hospital who fly the helicopters to get
Sure.
people who need to be rushed back to the hospital. I did one with them, which was totally fascinating. Plus, I got a tour of the helicopters, which was very interesting as well. But again, these tools tap into human universals. As I mentioned before, run the experiment. Pick a tool, commit to using it for 45 days, and you'll be amazed at the results.
I'll put, I guess, Givitas, is it Givitas.com?
You can find it that way, or go to the company that we have based on the principles in the book. It's called giveandtakeinc.com.
And I assume that is associated with Dr. Adam Grant as well?
It is indeed. He's one of our advisors and partners in Give and Take Inc.
Good. Okay. This has been great. I do appreciate your additional time. If people have interest in this, should they contact you? Go to the website. Is there a request form? What's the best way to go about doing it?
Yeah, the best way would be to go to the website for the book. So it's thebooktitle.com. So that's all you have to do is ask.com.
Okay.
You can find out information about the book. We have a free assessment. There's also a free downloadable infographic of the all you have to do is ask process.
Yep.
And I invite people to download that and to freely share that with whomever. And right now we have a lot of podcasts up there, such as podcast now number 2 I've done with you.
Yeah.
So those podcasts are up there as well.
Okay. Well, great. I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
My pleasure, Frank. Thanks for having me on again.
Thanks for joining us on the Networking RX podcast. Please put what you've learned into action today and let us know if you have questions, comments, or ideas for future topics. You can email them to us at podcast@amspirit.com. That's AmSpirit.com. Finally, so you never miss an episode, be sure to subscribe to the Networking RX podcast through iTunes, Overcast, or however you receive your podcasts. Now get out and network with someone.
The Networking RX podcast is the copyright production of AmSpirit Business Connection. All rights reserved.